Allegations of police corruption are nothing new in Mexico, but it's rare to see federal officers face off against each other.
Mexican police apparently carrying out orders for gangsters. There have been many cases of corrupt police being sacked in Mexico, but this video shows that police often work for the people they're meant to hunt down.
May 28, 1999. A Mexican cop, Carlos Martinez, left the force to become a full-time cartel drug lord. While he did make a whole lot of money, the consequences of his actions changed the course of his life forever. Here are 5 times corrupt cops messed with the wrong cartel members. Number 5. Aelio Flores Mendoza. If you're ranking the dirtiest cops in Mexican history, Mr. Mendoza here would be at the top of the list, because he used his position as chief of police to manipulate both the government and Mexican cartels in the most insane way you could imagine. However, he did pay a price for it. Mendoza served as chief of police in the rural western area state of Jalisco, the same state where CJ&G bases most of its operations. For a while now, this group has been considered the most dangerous criminal organization in Mexico and the second most powerful drug cartel in the country after the Sinaloa cartel. They're controlled by the infamous El Mencho, one of the most wanted drug traffickers around the world. However, the CJ&G would never have attained this level of dominance in Mexico if not for their connections in the Mexican police force, particularly the help of Flores Mendoza. But how exactly did he help them? Flores Mendoza was chief of police in the town of Ameca, located in a rugged area of Jalisco, off the principal highway that links the beachside resort of Puerto Vallarta and the state capital of Guadalajara. He also coordinated the police chiefs in the region, including Ameca with 13 other municipalities, meaning he controlled more than half of the police task force in Jalisco. It's long been speculated that the head of the CJ&G, El Mencho, is hiding somewhere on this inland region between the 2 large cities, where a whopping $10 million bounty is on his head for any information that could lead to his arrest. Yet he's never been caught. The logical explanation for this is the fact that El Mencho and his associates paid Flores Mendoza and his men way more than $10 million to turn their backs on the cartel's operations. The CJ&G takes tons of cocaine and methamphetamine from Jalisco through different routes into the U.S. They're also heavily militarized and more violent than any other criminal organization. This is no joke. You can easily confuse a hit squad of the cartel for a battalion of Mexican soldiers. That's how sophisticated they look, but it's not just about their armor. The CJ&G has a special operations group and other sections for specific types of warfare. Its Hitman training program is strict and has been compared to the level of training received by special forces in the U.S. Their net income is over $8 billion from sales of cocaine and about $4 billion from crystal meth each year. And some say those numbers are too low. But let's not dive into the numbers game. The idea of paying a high-ranking police chief like Flores Mendoza millions just to keep him quiet is like scooping a bucket of water from a huge swimming pool. It doesn't affect the cartel's wealth. However, when the U.S. uncovered Mendoza's involvement within the cartel, he had to run. June 2022, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Mendoza, stating he provided law enforcement information to CJ&G in exchange for bribes. This sanction meant that any of his properties or interests in the U.S. had to be seized by the U.S. government. An arrest warrant should have also been issued by Mexican authorities, but it wasn't, and there's a reason why. In the sanction released, a man named Julio Cesar Montero Pinzon was also indicted. Julio's by far one of the most dangerous men in Mexico. He's orchestrated hundreds of high-profile assassinations for the CJ&G using high-powered weaponry. He was a close associate of Carlos Andres Rivera Varela, aka La Ferma, and Francisco Javier Gudino Aro, aka La Gallina. Together with both men, Pinzon acted as an intermediary between El Mencho and other senior members of the CJ&G. Now, these men were the ones who gave orders on extortion, kidnappings, and killings on behalf of El Mencho. Now, the reason this piece of information matters is because, instead of focusing on the corrupt police chief, the media shifted its attention to Montero Pinzon, allowing Mendoza to step down from his office as a free man. Today, no one knows exactly what happened to Mr. Mendoza. No arrest warrant has been issued. He's no longer a top police chief in Jalisco, and not even the Mexican government has made a comment about the sanction. So if you're just as curious as we are, you might be asking, where the heck did Severo Flores Mendoza go? Number 4. Carlos Landine Martinez. May 28, 1999, Carlos Martinez was permanently released from the Tamaulipas State Prison for his involvement with drug cartels and trafficking. He then decided to mess with the cartel a little further by becoming a full-time drug lord, but that led him straight to one place and one place only: his grave. 1955, Carlos Landine Martinez, alias El Puma, was born and raised in the city of Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico. From a young age, he always wanted to be a cop, so he enrolled and became a member of the Tamaulipas State Police, where he worked as the commander of a homicide task force. The crazy thing was, he was extremely good at his job, and even got nationwide fame for it. In the force, he was known as El Puma Uno, loosely translating to the Puma One, for his aggressive stance against the most wanted criminals in Tamaulipas. He was like the Batman of Tamaulipas, but all the accolades to his name dropped when the government uncovered incriminating evidence of his involvement in drug trafficking. March 1997, an arrest warrant was issued for the Attorney General's office to arrest El Puma and another police chief, Pablo Villanueva Hernandez, for their involvement with Los Nichos, a Reynosa-based drug gang. However, after pulling a few strings, El Puma was able to conceal all the evidence against him and got his freedom back, but not for long. Between 1995 and 99, El Puma lived a double life. During the day, he was chief of police, but by night, a drug trafficker. He worked closely with the Gulf Cartel and even ran his own drug trafficking circle in the U.S. But it wasn't just smuggling drugs that made El Puma so important. It was how he did it that made him invincible to the Mexican and U.S. governments for those many years. His illegal activities began when his criminal drug trafficking cells in Granjeno and Peñitas, Texas, worked with a family-led smuggling ring headed by Francisco Meza Rojas, a former McAllen police officer. For nearly a decade, Carlos Martinez's cells were responsible for moving narcotics from Mexico into the U.S. Most of the drugs from the Gulf Cartel were cultivated in Michoacán, smuggled through Tamaulipas, and then making its way to South Texas, and then throughout the rest of the U.S. But how did it go unnoticed? Well, the drugs were smuggled via the Rio Grande River and dropped off in designated spots for arranged middlemen to pick up. Then they would be given to other smugglers, who met in the parking lots of businesses in the McAllen area, and since his associate was a police chief in this area, they had no fear of getting caught. Once the smugglers received the drugs, they would take it to stash houses across the city, and then distribute it to places like Dallas, Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, and New York City. Once the drug sales were finalized, couriers would bring the money back to Mexico from all over the U.S. through the Reynosa border crossing, siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars into El Puma's pockets and that of the Gulf Cartel. However, all that came crashing down when the governing administration of Tamaulipas was changed. May 28, 1999, Carlos was officially released from the police force after more evidence surfaced of his dealings with the Gulf Cartel. At first, this didn't change anything. He kept his drug trafficking trade as a retiree and moved to the U.S. to live with his family. But 6 years later, U.S. authorities would come after him. They found a tunnel he built to smuggle cocaine between Mexico and Texas, and there was more evidence of his links to the Gulf Cartel. Left with no other option, Carlos embraced the dark side. He became a fugitive and didn't hide his identity as a drug lord anymore. But rather than being a mere drug lord, Carlos decided to become this ruthless beast. He started collecting taxes from those independent drug traffickers who wanted to smuggle drugs through his well-built corridors between Tamaulipas municipalities of Gustavo Diaz Ordaz and Rio Bravo. Those who tried to interfere with this taxation or who were found responsible for losing drugs or money were kidnapped, tortured, and killed on Landine Martinez's orders. He became the second in command under the Gulf Cartel and was a major threat to the U.S. And so the U.S. would have to fight back. The DEA would team up with anti-drug forces in Mexico, launching Operation Puma, with Carlos Martinez being the main target. July 17, 2007, Martinez was spotted inside an H-E-B supermarket in McAllen, Texas, by off-duty DEA agent Leonardo Silva. Silva spotted Martinez as he was buying watermelons with his bodyguards beside him. At this time, he was already indicted in the U.S. on drug trafficking charges. So Silva decided to follow Martinez as he left that supermarket, calling the McAllen Police Department for assistance. Once his vehicle was intercepted, Martinez willingly submitted to the cops and was arrested without any resistance. Shocking, right? Well, what was more shocking was the fact that his trial only lasted 7 days before he was nailed to the cross of life imprisonment. However, due to the fact that he took a plea deal, his sentence was reduced and was expected to be released on October 30th, 2029. He died in prison on December 9th, 2021. Number 3. Gado Garcia Luna.
Gado Garcia Luna, charged with leading the fight against narco-trafficking, was convicted Tuesday for accepting millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel.
In 2006, then-Mexican President Felipe Calderon told Mr. Luna to shake up law enforcement and go to war against the cartels. Sadly, in one of the most upsetting turn of events, Garcia Luna accepted millions of dollars as bribe and protected the same cartels that he was supposed to prosecute. July 10th, 1968 marked the birth date of Garcia in Mexico City. He completed his primary education and got his first degree in Mexico before crossing into the U.S. to get his master's and establish himself as a well-known member of society. Garcia started his career in intelligence at the Center for National Security and Investigation. But a few years later, he would be appointed to the director of the Federal Investigation Agency in Mexico. This was around the time former President Calderon assumed office. He saw Garcia Luna as a reputable man, and he gave him the responsibility of cracking down these drug lords as he officially launched the war on drugs. They say money doesn't buy loyalty, but I say it depends on how much is at stake. For Garcia, a few million did the job to get him on the side of El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel, but the real question is, how? From 2006 to 2012, Garcia Luna was Mexico's top law enforcement official, serving as Secretary of Public Security and, in that capacity, controlled Mexico's federal police force. However, Garcia used his office to assist the violent Sinaloa drug cartel by providing inside information on drug raids, as well as aiding the trafficking of cocaine into the U.S. by ensuring the safe passage of their shipments. In some cases, Garcia gave some task force members to act as bodyguards and escorts for El Chapo. At other times, he would just send them uniforms and badges to wear so they can get through the checkpoints and airports. It was almost impossible for anyone to uncover his shady dealings until he attempted to please the people of Mexico with a fake stunt. December 9th, 2005. Garcia led the Agency of Federal Investigation, or AFI, to a ranch where kidnapping victims were supposedly being held. In reality, the entire operation was staged. The alleged kidnappers, shown to the Mexican public as having been detained live at the scene, were actually detained the previous morning and were held illegally without being presented to a judge for almost 20 hours. Worst of all, one of these alleged kidnappers revealed he was tortured into playing along. The story went viral, drawing questions about Garcia's competence from international outlets, one of which was the New York Strike Force. This organization's a crime-fighting unit comprising federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in the U.S. They began digging deep into Garcia's records, collecting as much data as they could on his whereabouts. One of their key findings came from a former Sinaloa cartel member, claiming to have personally handed Garcia thousands of dollars for information given to El Chapo. He also revealed some of the locations where Garcia's transactions took place in Mexico and the U.S. This was added to another infamous drug lord's testimony of gifting Garcia a suitcase containing $3 million in 2005 and paying him another $3 to $5 million in 2007. Obviously, these claims could have been a lie to defame Garcia. Looking at his lifestyle, we could see this guy was way above his paycheck. He had luxurious cars and properties in Mexico City. Plus, his family had inherited multiple real estate properties around the U.S. By the time substantial evidence against Garcia was obtained, he was arrested. December 2019. Garcia Luna was arrested by federal U.S. agents in Dallas, Texas, on charges of drug trafficking and conspiracy that involved taking millions of dollars in bribes from El Chapo. He pled not guilty to these charges despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He hasn't been sentenced yet. However, the prosecutors believe he'll be getting the maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Number 2. Aelio Cano Flores. Just like the story of El Puma, Cano Flores was also a cop in Tamaulipas. But in this case, he wasn't as smart with his drug trafficking affairs. May 3, 1972, Flores was born in the state of Tamaulipas. He joined the police force after going through training as a teenager, but along the line he decided to take an interesting job within the Gulf Cartel. At the time, the Gulf Cartel was one of the richest and most brutal criminal organizations in all of Mexico. They had their hands in everything, from drug trafficking to arms dealing, you name it. Their main source of income, however, came from shipping cocaine to the U.S. through the Mexico-U.S. border. In the 1990s, they went to war with the faction of their own cartel, Los Zetas, leading to a split, sending the Gulf Cartel into a decline. Despite losing members daily, they remained a top crime syndicate until a tragic event in 1999. On November 9th, former Gulf Cartel leader Garcia, along with about 15 sicarios, held 2 federal officers, one FBI and the other DEA, at gunpoint in Matamoros, Mexico. These agents were gathering intel on the cartel's operations. Despite this intense standoff, the agents managed to use persuasion, saying that they would bring the full force of the U.S. government down on this Gulf cartel. Garcia released them with a warning never to return. So maybe that wasn't his best decision, because letting him go triggered a massive manhunt by the U.S. government, making him an internationally wanted criminal with a $2 million bounty on his head. The story would take a wild turn from here, but despite the chaos, the cartel as a whole still managed to rake in substantial profits every year. The profit was like a pot of gold that almost everyone wanted to dip their hands into, including Mr. Flores. So he used his role in Mexican law enforcement and his ties with the Gulf Cartel to recruit many specially trained policemen into the crime syndicate's ranks. These policemen were adopted as sicarios to orchestrate assassinations of high-profile enemies, as well as train other young cartel members. Soon enough, Flores became the regional boss of the Gulf Cartel in Los Gueda, a town in the municipality of Ciudad Miguel Alemán, Tamaulipas. He was also a leader in Camargo, Tamaulipas, where he coordinated heroin, cocaine, and marijuana shipments to the U.S. But here's why we said Cano Flores wasn't really smart with his affairs. He double-crossed the Gulf Cartel by aligning with their rivals, Los Zetas. And yeah, the Zetas were once part of the Gulf Cartel back in 1997. In Tamaulipas, Mexico, a man named Ociel Cardenasquien took charge of the Gulf Cartel. However, the decision sparked a violent conflict that even Ociel found hard to manage. So in a bid to bring the war to an end, Ociel turned to an old friend, who coincidentally held a high position as an army lieutenant. Surprisingly, Ociel wasn't seeking the involvement of the Mexican army. Instead, he asked his friend Decena to assemble an additional force of skilled, deserted army soldiers to support his battle against rival drug lords within the Gulf Cartel. Decena fulfilled Ociel's request, recruiting approximately 30 highly trained soldiers from the Mexican Special Forces Battalion. As expected, these elite soldiers swiftly eliminated Ociel's competition, establishing him as the sole authority. However, Ociel's reign was short-lived as he was arrested and extradited to the U.S. Subsequently, the Gulf Cartel witnessed a shift in leadership, with Heriberto Lascano creating the notorious group known as Los Zetas. Despite knowing this little piece of history, Cano Flores, probably for more money or more power, decided to work for the Zetas, but it cost him his life. 3:14 p.m., June 10, 2009, Mr. Flores was arrested by Mexican Marines around the border of Tamaulipas. The area had been under surveillance for a while, and his movements were being monitored. He was arrested while in possession of a firearm, a magazine device, and around 30 rounds of ammunition. Then a year later, he was indicted, along with 19 other drug traffickers, before his extradition to the U.S. May 14, 2013, Cano Flores was sentenced to 35 years behind bars. This made him the highest-ranking drug lord of the Gulf Cartel to be convicted by a U.S. jury in 15 years. I guess that's gotta count for something. And number 1, Ivon Reyes Arzate, January 2020. This man, a former Mexican federal police commander, was charged with accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes from Mexican drug cartels to help him send cocaine straight to the U.S. For context, this guy was a Mexican federal police officer assigned to the DEA's elite police unit in Mexico, the SIU. This elite force had a long-standing issue with the DEA and its operations in Mexico. Now, the SIU was set up by the U.S. Congress in '97 in several Latin American countries, including Mexico. Their main job was to train local anti-drug agents to stop illegal substances from reaching the U.S. Good job. Here's the catch. The DEA and its overseas units are supposed to work solely towards U.S. law enforcement goals. According to the Department of Justice, investigations abroad are meant to aid the DEA's work within the U.S., building cases against major drug trafficking groups that impact the U.S. market. The thing is, there's no formal obligations for these operations to enhance security or combat local crime in the host country. That sets up a problem between what the U.S. government wants and what the country where these operations happen needs. It's like a tug-of-war between the U.S. and host country. You see, the thing is, for a sovereign government outside the U.S., prioritizing enforcing U.S. law within its own territory isn't really ideal. It's not just a sovereignty issue, but a power dynamic, hampering down the host country's ability to create and implement its own security strategies. This clash has been visible in Mexico over the past few decades due to the expanding presence of the DEA. SIU would often work with U.S. law enforcement to combat narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and other criminal activities. Agents in this force underwent vetting and training in the U.S., plus they've been credited with assisting American agents in major cases, including the capture and prosecution of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. In 2003, Arzate served as a mere officer. 10 years later, he was appointed SIU commander, making him the highest-ranking officer and principal point of contact for information sharing between the U.S. and Mexican law enforcement. November 2016, while participating in a joint investigation of El Seguimiento 39 with U.S. law enforcement authorities, Reyes Arzate met with the leadership of this organization and gave him information about the U.S.'s investigation. In return, the cartel handed him a nice $290,000 bribe. In 2018, he pled no contest to these allegations of involvement with the Beltran-Leyva cartel, earning him a 3-year sentence in a U.S. federal prison. Then he pled guilty in a U.S. district court in New York to conspiring with the El Seguimiento 39 drug cartel, which authorities said is connected to the notorious Sinaloa cartel and El Chapo Guzman. He was handed an additional sentence for that. Ivon Reyes Arzate's last words during his sentence were,
"I know the scourge of drugs caused a lot of pain to a lot of people. I profoundly regret whatever pain was caused by my actions."
These are men who once stood at the pinnacle of law enforcement in Mexico. Now they'll have to live the rest of their days as traitors to their country and to the honest members of law enforcement who risk their lives daily to dismantle drug cartels.